Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I am very excited to share with you these two lovelies that just came in the mail. So this will be my first impressions of these two products, but these are the latest releases as part of Pat McGrath's Divine Rose 2 collection. So here we have the eyeshadow quad in Eternal Eden, and over here we have the highlighter. So I am super excited to dip into these products. I ordered both of these the moment they dropped on Pat McGrath's website, but unfortunately with all the snowstorms, it's taken these a little bit of time to get to me, but now they're here. So I am super excited to try these out, share with you guys some swatches, a lot of comparison swatches, a demo, and my overall first thoughts about these products. So without further ado, let's get into some swatches. Alrighty, so let's first get into this Divine Rose highlighter. And this is the Skin Fetish Ultra Glow Highlighter, Illuminator Ultra Brilliance Skin Fetish. So quite a mouthful, but let's go ahead and unbox this. Ooh, look at that. I love this pink reflective chrome packaging. Ooh, very pretty. Nice mirror over here. Other people I think have mentioned this, but it is a pretty light product. So I kind of missed the bandwagon with all of the highlighter releases last year, the Natasha Denona, Pat McGrath, and Charlotte Tilbury ones. So I was really excited when I saw this released because I am usually not someone who gets a lot of single pan highlighters. But if you guys saw my Beautylish video, you know I really loved the Oma Beauty highlighter there. Once this was released, I was very excited to jump on this and add this to my collection. This is a pretty pricey highlighter coming in at $48. So definitely the most I have ever spent on highlighter. But hey, hopefully it lives up to all the hype. Let me just go ahead and swatch this for you guys. So here it is finger swatched. So it's a very beautiful peachy tone with kind of a golden flip to it. So let's just go ahead and swipe this on the arm. Okay, I think in the wrist swatch, you can maybe see the pink a little bit better, but it definitely has kind of a pink peach golden tone to it. Very, very pretty. So next up we have the Eternal Eden Luxe Quad. So let's go ahead and unbox this beauty over here. So this is in the traditional black lacquer packaging, but she has removed the golden backing to these. So I think this quad is a little bit less heavy than some of the previous quads. Now it's just kind of a plain black backing with the shade names over here. And so that's in contrast to, say, her motherships that have this gold plating and some of the other quads that have that as well. And this product is made in the US of US and imported ingredients, and it rings in at $58. So quite a pricey quad, but you know, for the Pat McGrath luxury experience. So I mentioned where it's made from because it seems like Pat McGrath has a few different formulas that are manufactured in different places. So I think usually her motherships are manufactured in Italy, and so it might be a slightly different formula in this quad because it's manufactured in the US. So let's go ahead and swatch these as well. I'm gonna first just swatch these on my fingers so you can see the finger swatches. And there we are. Aren't they so pretty? This is definitely more of a pinky mauvey color story than the Mothership palette for Divine Rose 2, so I'm hoping this will nicely complement that. But let's go ahead and just swatch these, and I'm gonna leave a little bit of space in between for our comparison swatches. So this first shade is Pink Mystique, and I would say it swatches a lot more pink than it might look in pan. I think in pan, because it's less pink than this one, it looks like it might be more of a golden champagne. But you can see in the swatch, especially in comparison to the highlighter, it definitely has a much stronger pink to it. Though other than that, it's actually quite similar to the highlight. This is sort of, I guess, the eyeshadow version of this highlighter. So next we have Temptation. And this is in kind of a creamy matte formula. So I think this is a relatively new formula for Pat McGrath. And the shade is a really pretty kind of fuchsia pink, but slightly more muted than some of her other pink shades. So I think this will be really gorgeous blended out in the crease. Next, we have Earthly Delight. And this shade kind of surprised me because I remember when the shade descriptions first came out, this was described as a brown shade. But then when I started seeing some swatches and people actually putting it on their lids, and also now for me seeing it in person, I think it's definitely a lot more of a mauve tone than a brown tone. Like there's definitely some brownish undertones to this, but I would definitely put it more in the mauvey, almost purpley camp rather than in the brown camp. And then finally we have Forbidden Fruit, and this is definitely the more show-stopping shade in the palette. So this is just a gorgeous shine. Like even after I did that swatch, my finger still has so much pigmentation and shine to it. So this has a beautiful brownish mauvey base to it, and then gorgeous pinky reflex that almost appear a bit lilac in the light. So here we are with all of the swatches. I think this is a really gorgeous, very coherent color story. I am super excited to put these on my lids. Before we do that though, I do want to do some comparison swatches. So first off, I want to swatch it against the Natasha Denona Mini Love palette because these are two releases kind of coming very close to each other in time since both of them are for Valentine's Day. And honestly, when I saw this collection, I was like, oh man, this looks very similar because it's kind of a related color story to this palette. And then of course the highlighter especially I think is quite similar to the highlighter that Natasha Denona came out with. So, I mean, you know, to be fair, I think Valentine's Day comes with a very specific color story, but it is kind of interesting how similar these are. So I wanted to swatch this in case any of you are debating between these two. And obviously the Pat McGrath one is way more expensive than the Mini Love. So let's see how dupeable these are. So first off, taking You in the Natasha Denona, let's swatch that against this Forbidden Fruit shade. These are actually quite different shades at the end of the day. So I think in the camera, they look somewhat similar because you're primarily getting the pink in both of them. But if I look at it from this angle, You has a pretty strong bronzy, almost like golden orange shift to it since it is a dual chrome. Whereas Forbidden Fruit, I don't think is actually a dual chrome shade, and the shine is much more lilac and cool toned. So these are definitely quite different. Although I will say that You almost kind of looks like these two shades combined, obviously in a totally different finish, but it does kind of have some of the warmth of Earthly Delight. Next up, let's swatch these two purpley shades. And I know these aren't going to be very similar, but let me just go ahead and put them next to Earthly Delight. So you can see that these are definitely way more cool toned and purple, whereas Earthly Delight definitely has more of that muted mauve, slight brown tinge to it. So quite a different look. And then the last two shades, let's swatch True over here. So you can see True is definitely much more of a bright white shade than the highlighter, and definitely doesn't have that strong pink that Pink Mystique has. So a very different shade there. Though I think sheared out, it might give a somewhat similar effect to the highlighter. The main difference I think is that the Natasha Denona shade doesn't really have any of that gold to it. It's really just a white champagne with a pink flip rather than something that has more of a gold flip. And then finally, let's swatch Love over here. Okay, so I think those are definitely the most similar. So very different finish in that the Pat McGrath is matte, whereas the Natasha Denona is a shimmer finish. But I would say the color is quite similar. The Natasha Denona also does have a little bit more of a golden sheen to it. So it does have a little bit of a flip to it, whereas of course the matte pink does not in the Pat McGrath. So they're definitely different shades, but I think overall the color stories are somewhat similar. I think the main difference is that the Natasha Denona probably pulls a little bit more cool toned and a bit more purpley. But other than that, I think you can accomplish somewhat similar looks with these two palettes. Next up, let's compare this with the Divine Rose 2 Mothership palette. So first off, just holding these next to each other, I would say they are quite different. They definitely have very related color stories, but as I mentioned, I think this one does run more mauvey pink than the Divine Rose palette overall. But let's go in and see if we can find any similarities in the swatches. So the first comparison that stood out to me was that I think Rose Seduction might be somewhat similar to this pink shade. Yeah, I would say they're very similar shades. Maybe Rose Seduction is just ever so slightly cooler toned or slightly more fuchsia, but probably the biggest difference is just the finish. So Rose Seduction is a satin shade, whereas Temptation is a matte shade. But overall, quite similar, so I think these will provide a similar effect if you blend them out in your crease. Next up, let's take Divine Dusk, and I feel like I'm gonna swatch this right here, kind of in between these two. It looks quite similar in tone to Earthly Delight, but has that shiny finish of Forbidden Fruit. So yeah, I'm actually quite surprised how similar these two look. Kind of like you took Earthly Delight and added some shimmer and then you would get Divine Dusk, or if you took the shimmer out of Divine Dusk, you would get Earthly Delight. Next, let's put Eleganza here as well. I think this will be less similar. Eleganza is more similar to Forbidden Fruit, so it's a little bit cooler toned and less rosy than Forbidden Fruit, but they do have a pretty similar effect. I think on the lids, they might not look that different. Next up, I know Sextraterrestrial is gonna look very different, but I just wanna see if the pink in Sextraterrestrial looks the same. Okay, yeah, I would say if you look just at the pink shift in Sextraterrestrial, it's very similar to the pink in Forbidden Fruit. Of course, Sextraterrestrial does have that flip to it, which you can probably see more clearly on my finger. So definitely not a dupe, but the pink shade is roughly the same pink. Next, let's just try the Skin Show Rose Opal shade over here. And yeah, that's quite different, I would say, than these other shades. Similar to the shade in the Natasha Denona palette, it only has a pink shift. It doesn't really have that golden shift to it. So it's definitely a bit cooler toned than either of these over here. And then lastly, let's just try out this Astral Pink Moon shade, which I'm sure is quite different as well, but just for comparison's sake. Astral Pink Moon mostly has kind of a golden glitter to it, so it doesn't really have the pinky peachiness that either of these two shades have. Oh, and actually, let's also just quickly swatch this Extreme Burgundy shade. Quite a different shade, but I do think this will pair quite nicely with these two shades over here, because it kind of looks like a deepened version of Earthly Delight with some more purple to it. So I think it sits actually quite nicely between these two shades. Alrighty, next up, so we have Divine Rose, the original Mothership palette. So here I'm interested in seeing how this Rose Dusk shade compares. So I'm gonna just swatch that over here. So it's definitely a very different finish from Forbidden Fruit, and it doesn't have the same multi-dimensionality as Forbidden Fruit. I would say that it almost actually looks a lot more similar to the Natasha Denona shade, except it doesn't have that golden flip to it. So overall, I would say these are quite different, but definitely would give a somewhat similar effect on the lids. Then next, let's take a look at VR Rose Venus and compare that over here. So those are somewhat similar. I would say VR Rose Venus is a more amped up version of this Pink Mystique shade, and Pink Mystique is probably more pinky overall. For me personally, whenever I use VR Rose Venus, I find on the lids it primarily reads golden, which you can probably tell if the light is directly hitting it, it basically just looks gold. You kind of need to have pretty indirect lighting to get the pink shift. So I think Pink Mystique will probably look more pink on the lid than VR Rose Venus, but they are somewhat similar shades. And then this is much more of a stretch, but let's go ahead and just swatch Lovelace as well. And I'm just gonna put Lovelace over here. Lovelace is a very different shade, much more taupey and silver and lilac. It doesn't really have the pinky tones that we see with these other swatches. So I think those are all the comparisons with Divine Rose, the original Mothership, but I'm just gonna hold them up briefly so you guys can kind of see them side by side. Overall, I would say this Eternal Eden palette is much more pink compared to Divine Rose. It doesn't have the taupey, lilac-y purple tones that this palette has. Next up, I have my Golden Opulence palette. I don't think there are that many comparisons between these palettes, but I was thinking possibly this Pink Lotus shade. Let's just swatch this and compare it over here. Okay, so I think this Pink Lotus shade kind of looks like these two shades had a baby because it has that golden flip to it that this Pink Mystique shade has, but it's much more pigmented and the pink looks a lot more like this Temptation shade. I think that's really all in terms of Golden Opulence. Lastly, I just wanted to take a quick look at my Celestial Divinity palette. There might be some shades that are kind of similar. I mean, these are very different palettes. Let's see how Venusian Orchid compares. I think this will be a way lighter pink. All right, yeah, as I anticipated, Venusian Orchid is definitely a lot lighter, slightly cooler toned than Temptation. And then I'll just try Cosmic against Forbidden Fruit. So let's just put this down here. Cosmic is a lot lighter, I would say. So the pink here is a lot lighter compared to Forbidden Fruit. Alrighty, so those are all of the comparison swatches done. And I didn't find any straight up dupes for any of these shades, but I will say there's quite a lot of shades that are similar in the Natasha Denona Mini Love palette and also in the original Divine Rose 2 Mothership palette. So if you have either of those and this color story doesn't really speak to you as particularly unique, I think you can probably achieve a similar look with either of those palettes. But of course, the proof is in the pudding, so why don't we go ahead and put these on my lids and then I can give you guys a more thorough assessment in terms of how this compares to those other palettes. So to start things off, I'm going to take my Wayne Goss number 16 brush and go into Temptation. Wow, that picked up a lot of pigment, so I'm going to just dab this on. This is a Pat McGrath formula I haven't tried before because I think this is a new kind of formula that she's been releasing in her quads. It's a little bit more of a cream to powder type of formula. And wow, this is extremely pigmented. So let's just hope this blends out well. But definitely, if you are trying this palette, be very careful with your initial application because I think I really accidentally picked up way too much. That's okay. This is how we test out quality. We will know for sure whether this blends out nicely. So I think it's definitely shearing out nicely. I do feel like there's a little bit of patchiness as I blend it out because parts of it are just kind of being blended away a little bit. I can always, I guess, apply more layers. Like, I don't know if you guys can see on this side, but there's like a little bit of a bald spot over here. Okay, before going in with any more of Temptation, let's just go into some Earthly Delight to try to add a little bit more depth. So I have here my classic crease brush from Sonia G, and I think this will also help with some of these bald spots. Okay, yeah, this is also in that same kind of cream to powder formula. It's definitely picking up a lot of pigment. So I think with any new formula, there's always a little bit of a learning curve. So I am not going to fault the product for any challenges that I have today, but I think I'm gonna have to work on doing a better job of applying this. It does blend out very easily, which is nice, but like I was saying, I think as it blends out, it's not necessarily the most even blend. Alrighty, now that I have those two shades on my lid, I will say this palette is not going to provide you a whole lot of depth because I was hoping that Earthly Delight would provide a tiny bit more depth, but it's really more of a mid-tone shade and not actually any deeper than Temptation. It's just like a very different shade. Alrighty, now let's go into Pink Mystique. So I have my GSN 9 brush and I'm just going to put this on the inner third of my eye. And this is a nice shimmer formula. It doesn't really have a ton of shine to it, I would say, but blends very nicely, very pretty. And I'm also just going to take a little bit of that on the brow bone to see if it can be used for that purpose. Okay, yeah, I think it's still light enough that you can use it as a brow bone highlight. Though I think if you have the highlighter on hand, it might be better to use the highlighter as a brow bone highlight if you don't want a very strong pink cast. And now with the finger, I'm gonna go into Forbidden Fruit and just lay this all over my lid. Now I'm just gonna refine the edges a little bit with my GSN 9 brush. So I do just want a little bit more depth. So I'm gonna try again with Earthly Delight on a classic crease brush and just see if there's any way that this can be built up for just a tiny bit more dimension. Interesting. I feel like Earthly Delight layered over Temptation makes it look much more kind of lilac-y purple. It actually now reminds me a lot more of this lilac purple shade in the Mini Love story. I think I might take a tiny bit more of the Temptation shade and just add that back to the crease area. I do find this matte formula quite interesting in that I think it blends out a lot more easily than her traditional, more powdery matte formulas, but it also has more of the tendency to kind of just blend away, so I'm not really sure how I feel about that yet. Alrighty, so with the lids done, let's go into the lower lash line. So I'm gonna first on my Esom G27 brush take some of that bright pink Temptation shade and just sweep it all along the lower lash line. And then taking Earthly Delight, I'm gonna put this in the outer corners. And then I'm gonna take Pink Mystique and just sweep that along the inner 2/3. And then to finish off the look, I'm gonna take my mini booster from Sonia G in Pink Mystique and just kind of stamp that in the inner corners. That's the eyeshadow look done, so I'm gonna go ahead and do some eyeliner, put on some bronzer, and then I'll be back for the rest of this look. And we're back. So I went in with my M Cosmetics brush liner and my Gucci bronzer in shade 2. And for the blush, I thought it'd actually be kind of fun to try this pink shade over here. So I'll try my best to take a light hand, and I have here my Artist Medium brush from Wayne Goss. So let me just see if I just very lightly dab this and then blend it out, if that works. Now we are ready for this star. So I have my Artist Small from Wayne Goss, and I'm just gonna shimmy my brush and apply a nice amount of that. Okay, this gives a really beautiful sheen. I hope you guys can see that. I feel like my camera is terrible at picking up highlighter, but I'm gonna try to really build it up so you guys can see it. I would say applied to the skin, you don't see the pink as much other than the fact that the pink kind of complements the blush. You more so see that golden reflect. Add more on the side as well, just to further amp things up. Alrighty, so that's the highlight on. Hope you guys are able to see the reflectivity. It's a really gorgeous highlighter and actually looks less intense on the cheeks than what I was anticipating, given, you know, this whole pink packaging really makes you feel like it's gonna be really in your face. But I would say that with a sheer layer on, it actually is not hyper reflective. Definitely has a beautiful golden sheen to it, but it doesn't actually look that unnatural as a highlight. It just blurs really seamlessly into the skin, and you saw I added a lot of layers of this, but I feel like, you know, I definitely don't have that highlighter streak going. So I'm a fan. I think this is a really lovely product, and I do wish there was a little bit more of that pink on there. I'll have to maybe try this with either a different blush or maybe just like without blush to see if I can see more of that pinkiness to it. But kind of layered on top of blush, I feel like you don't really see the pink so much as just the gold. And now to finish off this look, I have Venus in Furs in Pat McGrath's Matte Trance formula. So this is described as a rose shade, so I hope this will just kind of tie the whole look together. So here we are with the final look. So I am a big fan of this look. I think it's such a gorgeous pinky mauvey toned look, and to be fair, I don't think it pairs very well with the dress that I wore today, which has a lot of orange going on with it. But if we just look at the makeup look itself and don't look at the overall look, I think this is really gorgeous. So now let's get into my overall first impressions and thoughts about these products. So first off, starting with the highlighter, I am quite excited for this product. Like I said, I did not get the holiday collection highlighter that she released. So I think that packaging was maybe a little bit more luxe than this. So I am slightly disappointed that this packaging isn't more luxe. but it is really gorgeous, and I think the highlighter is very beautiful. I am really interested in seeing how this highlighter looks by itself, because I think right now having it on top of the blush doesn't necessarily bring out much of the pink. And for me personally, what I'm really excited about regarding this highlighter is having that pinky gold flip to it, because those are two shades that I really love and also incorporate in a lot of my looks. But overall, upon my first impressions, quite pleased. I think the highlighter is very natural, does not emphasize texture at all, and even if you build up several layers of it, it doesn't really have a blinding, unnatural looking effect. That said, if you are buying this highlighter because you want kind of that blinding effect, you might be a bit disappointed. So I tried layering it on quite a bit, but I feel like it still looks relatively natural. And for me, I think that's fine, but I do sometimes like, you know, a shinier highlight. So this is probably not the highlight I'm going to reach for on days when I do want something a bit more blingy. Now for my thoughts on the eyeshadow quad. So now that I have the shades on my lids, I will say that I think the overall look you get from this quad is actually quite similar to the look that you get from the Mini Love story. So if you are just interested in the looks that you can get and you really don't want a lot of redundancy in your makeup collection, I would actually suggest maybe just picking up this palette because it is only $25, whereas this one is almost $60. That said, I do think the formula is extremely different. And for me personally, I did find these formulas to be a little bit easier to work with than the Natasha Denona ones. So Natasha Denona also has a slightly creamy matte formula. I think these two creamy mattes blended out very, very easily on the lids. Like I said, there was a little bit of patchiness, but I experienced worse patchiness with the mattes in this palette. I also personally, I think, just like the color story of this palette a little bit more, but on the whole, with the price differences included, I would definitely say this one is probably more worth it for value. This one is definitely the one to go for if you want more of that kind of luxurious experience, you like this whole black lacquer packaging. Those would be some of the major comparisons I'd make there. In addition, I would say if you already have the two Divine Rose Mothership palettes, you probably can make a quite similar look to this, because again, I think Rose Seduction is a good dupe for that shade. And I think maybe if you mix together Valoria and Extreme Mahogany, you might get something similar to this shade. And then as you can see down here with Forbidden Fruit, there's not really a dupe that I have on my arm, but there's a lot of shades that are probably, you know, similar-ish enough that on the lids, they probably won't look super different. And then with these shades up here, VR Rose Venus, maybe mixed actually with the highlighter, would produce a relatively similar effect. So in that sense, I don't think this is really gonna dramatically increase the number of looks you can do. That said, it is a really beautiful quad, and so if you want this kind of look and you don't want to be doing a lot of, you know, mixing and matching of shades on your own, then I think this is great. And especially if you don't have both of the Divine Rose Mothership palettes and you like this color story, then at least this is a lot cheaper than getting a full-blown Mothership. So the fact that you can achieve a somewhat similar look could be a good value if this is primarily the kind of color story you want to go for. So for me personally, I would say, given that I do have these other palettes, I am a tiny bit disappointed that it isn't a more interesting look, and especially because I think with both of the products, they're not necessarily as luxurious of a Pat McGrath experience as, say, her Mothership palettes provide. So given the price, I would have wanted, for example, you know, more of that gold backing here, maybe like a beveled mirror. Like this is just kind of a flat mirror laid in here, whereas her Mothership palettes have this beautiful beveled mirror. And with the highlighter, it's just kind of more of a light compact. It's a really beautiful compact, but it doesn't have that sort of weighty luxury product experience. So for me personally, I think I'll probably keep this palette just because I am a bit of a makeup collector and I am a major Pat McGrath fan. But I will say for most people, if you have any of these other palettes, buying this palette is probably not the best value, and it's probably better just to save up for a different palette that might be able to provide some different looks. So those are my overall thoughts and first impressions about these products. Let me know down below in the comments if you guys are picking up either of these products, or if you have already, what your thoughts are. And I know also a bunch of lip products came out with this collection, which I personally did not pick up because I recently have just been hauling so many lip products, including from Pat McGrath. But I'm curious if any of you guys have tried those products, what your thoughts were. I am a huge fan of Divine Rose and Divine Rose 2 in particular, but I will admit I am hoping that the next release from Pat McGrath is something a little bit different, just because I do think we're kind of reaching the saturation point with pinky, purpley, mauvey shadows. So, you know, I'm kind of ready for something different, but hopefully today's video was helpful in case you guys are interested in any of these products. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys so much for taking time to join me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!